Hello, everyone, and welcome to our first SASGOG researcher interview. I'm Caitlin Martin. I'm Assistant Professor at Virginia Commonwealth University in Richmond, Virginia. And in this series of interviews, we'll be talking to different researchers within the SASGOG organization and talking to them about their different experiences and integrating research into their careers as specialists in general obstetrics and gynecology. Today, I have the great pleasure for our first interview to talk to Dr. Tucker Edmonds. Dr. Tucker Edmonds, can you please start us off by please introducing yourself and telling us where you are from originally, your current positions and responsibilities within your institution? And Dr. Tucker Edmonds, you are muted.
First things first, you would think after all of this Zooming, we'd catch on to that. Alas, thank you for that introduction. My name is Brownsyne Tucker Edmonds. I am an associate professor of obstetrics and gynecology and clinical pediatrics at Indiana University School of Medicine. There, I serve our department as the vice chair for faculty development and diversity. I serve in our CTSI as the director of diversity and recently took on a new leadership role, co-directing workforce development for our CTSI. And then at the school level, I serve as an assistant dean for diversity affairs.
Lovely, lovely.
I didn't tell you where I am from originally. I apologize, but I'm originally from Atlanta, Georgia. And so I always tell people that I'm sort of a Southerner at heart, though I haven't lived there my entire adult life, but that definitely sort of grounds me in terms of my formative sense of identity.
I can say that southern part of you never goes away, no matter where you go.
Precisely.
Well, next, can you please just tell us a little bit about your research interest, as well as any current and recent research endeavors in the areas that you've been involved with or you're leading?
Absolutely. So my research broadly is really focused on shared decision-making and health equity kind of in high-risk obstetrical settings. My sort of early work and the work I continue to do now is really focused around peri-viable care. I came out of fellowship really with interest in understanding the ways that like race, class, culture impact upon sort of our counseling and decision-making exchanges. And then I came to shared decision-making actually as a model that I ultimately felt like was optimal for trying to mitigate some of the biases that operate in sort of patient-provider interactions and to try to really optimize centering patients' needs and priorities in providing them with clinical care. And so that work, in terms of the peri-viable work, is work that I've done for some time now. But the shared decision-making work sort of more broadly has also taken me in directions, I guess most recently, I'm doing some more work around reproductive justice in sort of the contraceptive and family planning space, recognizing that it's the same, several of the same skills and competencies are really needed, I think, to be able to navigate those sort of difficult waters and some of the challenging, I think, cultural and historical contexts that can make providing care in that setting particularly challenging.
It's such an interesting area of research, and I can say that just hearing a little bit about it from you, that is an area that all specialists in obstetrics and gynecology should be interested in and probably delve more into, and can apply to many different areas within our specialty and probably outside of our specialty too.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think it's interesting because on the one hand, we kind of joke in the space around shared decision making because it's almost like a punchline at this point, like everything, is like the right answer is shared decision making. I feel like a lot of people are talking about it, but very few people know what it actually is, and even fewer people know how to like deploy it or implement it in their day-to-day kind of care. And so I do think it's a huge space of opportunity for both, sort of investigation, but also I think for sort of quality efforts and, interventions that are needed to be able to really help us deploy this in meaningful ways. And like I said, I've always approached it or come to it through the lens of sort of equity. And I really do feel like it's a model that has the ability to also help us to mitigate biases that we know operate in our care.
Mm-hmm. Well, I would love to hear more about what actually sparked your interest in this research area and experiences that brought you to where you are today as a researcher in this area, including any aspects of your training that prepared you for
Mhm.
success.
Sure. Um, Wow. Well, I want to be mindful of our time, and I want to start at the right place in the story. I think that um, I would immediately, my mind goes to obviously to residency and my resident research project, but I would step back one step from there to note that I actually kind of fell in love with epidemiology um, as a senior in college. So I took a class with Kate LePan, shout out to Kate, at Brown my senior year, and really as a community health sort of concentrator, really got the bug around epidemiology. And I think that that was what I did, like my senior, senior thesis work there as an undergrad. And funny, it's interesting that I've come somewhat full circle because I did that project on looking back in that time. There was more controversy around Norplant, and it was like really that early set of concerns about coercion and reproductive control for Black women and Black bodies that at that point in time I was sort of exploring, looking at whether there were biases in prescribing patterns for providers for these sort of longer acting. We didn't sort of have, it wasn't the LARC moment yet, but these longer acting methods of well, I guess Norplant certainly would qualify as a LARC, but we didn't have the whole LARC conversation and discourse going on at that time. And so yeah, that was where I started actually with getting the bug around research. And then I did an MPH between my third and fourth year of medical school because, like I said, I kind of loved epidemiology. I went and did quantitative methods, was really interested in health disparities. But then when I got to residency, a woman named Annie Lyerly, who you may well know because she was down at UNC for some years. I don't know, but she really introduced me to qualitative research. And that is, I guess, another bug. I guess I get a lot of bugs. It was just so enlightening and enlivening in many regards to have this methodological toolkit that would allow me to really give voice to women, particularly with the voice of those who've been like marginalized, minoritized, the more vulnerable. Like those were the questions and the populations that I felt like we didn't know because we've never asked, So that was really turning point for me in terms of methods. And so I went on to do a research fellowship, a health policy, health services research fellowship. That's the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation Clinical Scholars Program. I did that at Penn. After residency. And then it's so funny, we'll probably, I'm sure at some point turn to like mentorship in the course of a conversation about building a research career. So it's again, where those like seeds are planted. And that's part of why I'm doing this, because, Jeff Pipert, who's my chair now, Maureen Phipps, who's now heading up ACOG, were both faculty at Brown who had done the RWJ program. And I actually didn't have a lot of interaction with them, but I just knew, as you kind of look around and sort of look at trajectories, that there were these like two folks who'd done this particular training that I couldn't even tell you what it was, but they seemed to be doing really cool research, asking really important questions, and doing having the kind of careers that I think, oh, like that would be fun or neat. So fast forward to my residency, I applied into the program really based on the fact that I had these two examples of people who had done this kind of training and gone on to have more research oriented careers. And the training was also focused on policy. So it was training that was going to help you do research to inform policy and practice and policy making. And that to me felt like the perfect kind of point of intersection for all the things that I thought were important and meaningful. So I did the clinical scholars program, and actually somewhere between my fourth year of residency and starting the clinical scholars program, I got really interested in death and dying, particularly in the onc space, which is interesting. And I started to really be concerned about the experience of the bereaved, because I felt like we were getting into having a lot of challenges, frankly, and sometimes conflict, particularly in caring for African-American families around like end-of-life decision-making. And so when I got to the clinical scholars program, I said, I want to study end-of-life decision-making. And they looked at me and they were like, Brownsyne, you're an OBGYN. And I was like, oh, is that going to be a problem? And so it was like that moment where, I started to look at sort of end of life decision making at the beginning of life, kind of looking at this obstetrical parallel, and then looking to see what were the models for communication and for decision making and care that they were probably a decade or so, still relatively young as a field, palliative care at that moment, but definitely out in front of where we as sort of obstetricians, and I would dare even say also in the neonatology realm, were with regard to really thinking about how to communicate and how to center sort of patient preferences in this space. So that's really how that whole sort of train of thought, there had been a body of literature that had shown racial difference in end-of-life decision-making at the end of life for terminally ill adults. And really, if you look across the board, all the way across NICU studies, pediatric studies, et cetera, but there hadn't been that work looking to see if there were those differences in this peri-viable space around like desiring intervention or not. And that was really the first set of questions that that I sort of tackled as a fellow, and they really laid the foundation for the rest of the work that I would go to do.
You brought up so many great points in that story. Thank you so much for sharing. Something I just want to point out is that you brought up the importance of seeing examples of people as you were going along with your training and kind of progressing in your career, examples of clinician researchers, and how they piece together different areas of interest and different responsibilities. And seeing that early on was really helpful to you to see, oh, this is something that I can do. I can do this too, and working towards a goal. And we're hoping that with this series of interviews that we can hopefully provide that to some other people that might not have such examples readily available to them. So thank you for sharing. Another thing that you brought up, I think that's a great thing to talk about more, if you can talk about this, is you're kind of piecing together of areas outside of traditional obstetrics and gynecology research, and how you went a little bit like this with your career, which I think all of us as researchers do. Things fall into place, and when you look retrospectively, oh, it makes sense, but in the moment it might not. And so can you just talk a little bit more about that experience, kind of going outside maybe your traditional department of OBGYN, and how that maybe facilitated you integrating research into your career?
Oh, absolutely. Because it's such a critically important point, particularly, I think, particularly for generalists. I mean, historically, like in our realm, and this is unlike internal medicine and like general pediatrics, et cetera, like there are some other like primary care spaces where research has sort of historically been sort of the home has been in the generalist space, whereas in obstetrics, we sort of have our subspecialists who get the research training more often. And so the generalist space has really kind of been more the worker bee space, and where we're sort of be generating the RVUs to really support the larger effort. And it's sort of flipped on its head in some of our other, some of the other areas like internal medicine and pediatrics. So for me to be looking for a job, I was looking for a 75-25, like predominantly research role. I knew that was going to be more challenging to come by in an obstetrical field as a generalist in particular, let alone even as a subspecialist. But also, I knew that it was going to mean there weren't going to be a lot of examples and a lot of people who were sort of doing what I wanted to do in the way that I wanted to do it. And then you also spoke to the fact that I was also kind of at this odd intersection. I always tell people that I'm kind of an odd duck that's kind of like that, been, I don't know, it's the whole thing about to my own drum or whatever, marching to my own. That's been pretty characteristic of me all from day one. And so I knew I was going to have to, I was kind of, in some regard, pioneering in a space, but that it was going to require the mentorship and the guidance of people who brought different pieces of expertise to the table. And what that ended up looking like for me was really a panel approach to building a mentorship kind of panel and team, people who brought expertise around health disparities. It's interesting, when I got to campus at IU, my first friends were in a organization called Respect, which basically was around like end of life communication. So I had geriatricians and, people in palliative care, and they were mentoring me and helping to guide me. And they're like, and I'm, of course, the odd duck OB in all of these spaces. But again, it was really, was key. It was important to have those pieces of expertise. And it was also created a lot of opportunity because there were things that had been established and known in other settings that we just never really tried out in our own. And so I think it also was really generative in that regard. And then I will say as just a last comment to that, that ultimately, I mentioned starting the response that pediatrics and, there are some of those areas. Ultimately, my department, and I think you might find this in other places in OB departments, it really wasn't built for me as a health services researcher. I mean, it was there, I had great support, had great, mentorship. There were great examples, and there were folks who were doing clinical research and doing it well. But in terms of like coming in as a health services researcher, as this like odd duck, there wasn't really like an obvious place for me. But I found some mentorship out of pediatrics, that where they had sort of a health services whole unit around, for general peds. And again, being willing to kind of be okay with like being like the odd duck, the lone OB that went over to kind of live in community with the pediatricians. It ended up serving me so well. It was such a gift to really have. Now I had my clinical home, but I also had a research home and a research community of people who kind of got it and got me. And so that's how it has worked out for me, with just really thinking very interdisciplinarily around sort of mentorship, collaboration, and then also being willing to kind of build bridges in other spaces where maybe you wouldn't traditionally find someone with my training, but where there were other points of synergy that have been really meaningful in supporting my career, my success.
Mm-hmm. Thank you so much for pointing out all, some typical challenges that specialists in OBGYN do encounter as they're trying to advance their research careers in whatever way, shape, or form that looks like, and how you kind of overcame those challenges and focusing on that collaborative approach to not just collaborations in a research project, but also in your mentorship.
Mm-hmm.
And our last question, just to close, just on that note of everything that we've been talking about, is that what other advice would you give to other OBGYNs, either junior or seasoned, who are considering getting involved in research or pushing forward their research careers?
Yeah, I guess, well, two things initially come to mind that I think were critical for me. One is that you really, and it's hard, especially when you're kind of like midstream, but it really, like, some aspect of training does really matter. Like, you do need to sort of find, be it an internal sort of KL2 kind of program or an MSc. Sometimes there's like, master's programs, and it's not about the degree. It's like the degree. I want to be clear about that. I actually think in adult learning, it's really about sort of gaining the skills and going in and figuring out what are the pieces that I need to get, to do the things that I need to do. But I do think that the research endeavor is not one that's intuitive. And so I think that it does require some intentionality and some investment of time to kind of understand like how it's done, how it's, disseminated, sort of all of those pieces. So I would say if there are opportunities or resources within your institution to try to get some of the foundational building blocks and training, that would be something to take advantage of and to utilize. It's I think, going to be critical for success oftentimes. The other thing that strikes me, and I can't be talking to you at VCU and to not give Lee Learman his props as the person who recruited me out to IU. I mean, you can't say enough about having supportive leadership. And I absolutely, had he not been willing to make early investments in me, because everyone knows that, those early junior research people are not making huge deposits into the coffers at the department level. But, willing to make the investment, sort of bet on me, and then to kind of the continued support, because again, with the current funding climate, I mean, again, Dr. Pipe, my department still, supports me. There's those bridge moments. There are, resources and things. And so I do think that it's not for the faint of heart. I guess that would be the last thing that I would say, is that research involves a lot of rejection. And
Yes, it does.
A lot of failure and rejection. And so I think that would maybe be the last thing, is that, you've got to have good training, good support and mentorship, and a thick skin, and also just a real vision that the work that you're doing is meaningful, even though it can feel super incremental, but that there is something that really, that you're really passionate about, and moving forward and feeling like, you can make a difference. So.
Oh, thank you so much, Dr. Tucker Edmonds. Those last comments, as the junior faculty that you were referring to, I can definitely say that those comments are very true, and I'm feeling them right here. So we hope that with this interview, we can continue to inspire future researchers within the SASGOG organization, and also provide them with some mentorship via these interviews and some tidbits to kind of help them along the way. So I would like to thank you very much for your time today, for being our first interviewee for our SASGOG research interviews, and we appreciate your time very much.
It's really my pleasure. Thank you for the invitation.
You're welcome.